They said it was for my safety. Funny, how safety always looks like surveillance when you're the one being watched. That's what my son told me, with that calm, managerial tone he uses when he's already made a decision and just needs my signature on it. Mom, it's standard now. All these smart homes have monitoring devices. We just want to make sure you're safe at night. You fell once. We can't risk it again. He said it like I was a liability report, not a person. Susan stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding, the picture of a responsible daughter-in-law. She said, "It's only in your room, Eleanor. Just one camera, and you'll forget it's even there." I didn't forget. You don't forget something that blinks at you in the dark like a quiet accusation. The day they installed it, I was sitting in my armchair folding towels I didn't even need folded, just to keep my hands busy. The technician called me ma'am in that rehearsed, pitying way men use when they're talking to someone's mother. He asked if I wanted the lens angled toward the bed or the door. I said the door, and he smiled, thinking I didn't know why that mattered. He left, and the room smelled like new plastic and betrayal. I'm 82. I've lived through blackouts, cold wars, marriages, and morphine drips. But nothing feels as cold as realizing your own child doesn't trust you with your own night. After the installation, they took me to dinner to celebrate my independence. That's what they called it. A small Italian place with music, too loud for conversation. Susan ordered for me, said she likes soup, something easy to chew. I didn't correct her. I was watching the reflection of the wine glasses in the window, the way the candlelight caught on their surfaces and split them into tiny fragments. That's how I felt. Split, contained, refracted through someone else's concern. When we got home, my son kissed my forehead and said, "You'll sleep better, knowing we're watching out for you." I smiled, because that's what you do when you've already been placed inside a glass box and told it's a home. The first night, I stared at that small green light until dawn. Every time I turned, it followed, an unblinking pupil. I wondered if they were watching right then, sipping wine, shaking their heads at my restlessness. Safety, they would say. All for safety. In the mornings, I still make tea the way I always have. Loose leaves, proper steeping, no sugar. The kettle whistles, the sound sharp enough to cut through the hush that has settled over my days. I sit by the window, the camera behind me, and talk to the plants. Not because I'm lonely, though I am, but because talking reminds me I still own my voice. Sometimes I imagine the footage, my son reviewing it, Susan taking notes. She talks to herself, they'll whisper. Evidence. Proof. They collect my life in pixels now. I wonder if they'll keep the recordings after I'm gone, archive them the way families once kept letters. Or maybe they'll delete everything, like clearing the browsing history of a guilty conscience. Before the camera, I used to read in bed until midnight. Now, I turn the pages slower, conscious of every gesture. I imagine a silent jury in the cloud, judging how often I blink. The camera doesn't lie, they say, but it edits. It doesn't capture the smell of loneliness, the heaviness of knowing you're being managed by those you once bathed and fed. It only sees movement, proof of life or the lack of it. When I forget where I left my glasses, Susan will mention it casually. "You were looking for them for 10 minutes yesterday. I saw it on the feed." She laughs, but the sound lands wrong. It's data to her, intimacy turned into documentation. They say they don't watch all the time, only when the motion sensor alerts them. But I know how curiosity works. Once you start looking, you never stop. Sometimes I think about my late husband, Walter. He was a quiet man, an engineer, practical, methodical. He loved gadgets too, but not like this. He once told me machines are honest until people teach them to lie. I didn't understand then. Now I do. The camera is honest. It records. But the hands behind the review, the mouths that interpret, that's where the rot begins. I wonder what Walter would say if he saw me now, under surveillance in a house I helped pay for, reduced to a project of maintenance. He'd probably say, "You gave them too much." And he'd be right. I gave them everything. My time, my patience, the kind of forgiveness that grows mold in the corners when left unused too long. The strangest thing about being watched is how quickly you begin to perform. I find myself smiling more when I move around the room, speaking in complete sentences even when alone. I narrate what I'm doing, as if to reassure the unseen observers that I am coherent, that I still belong to the world of reason. "I'm making tea," I'll say. "I'm opening the window." The first time I caught myself doing it, I felt a flush of shame, like I'd betrayed something private and irreplaceable. But the habit stayed. That's what control does. It creeps in politely, disguised as routine. One evening, Susan came in with a new feature. "Voice integration," she said brightly. "You can talk to it now. Ask for music, lights, weather." She demonstrated, cheerful as a sales rep. "Alexa, play something relaxing for Eleanor." The speaker hummed, and soft piano filled the air. I smiled thinly. Later, alone, I whispered, "Alexa, turn off the camera." The light blinked red, then green. Nothing happened. I laughed then, a quiet, bitter sound. Even my defiance was being recorded. I started wondering what they'd do if they saw me standing too still or staring too long at the lens. Would they call? Would they think I'd fallen asleep? Or would they just take notes for the next conversation about safety? I remember a time when privacy was a form of dignity, not rebellion. When you could close a door and trust it to stay closed. Now, every hinge feels wired, every silence suspicious. But I play along. I let them think I'm harmless, fading, grateful. That's what they want. The illusion of control disguised as compassion. They don't understand that the mind, once cornered, sharpens. That behind every polite nod is a plan forming, slow and steady, like water carving stone. A week after the installation, my son brought home papers for me to sign. "Routine updates," he said. "Medical permissions, property adjustments, financial safety nets." The language was dense, legal. He hovered by the door, watching me read, pretending not to. The camera watched too. 2 sets of eyes, one of them mechanical, both expecting compliance. I smiled, set the papers aside, said I'd go over them in the morning. He seemed relieved, like a man who's already rehearsed the outcome. When he left, I turned off the light and sat there in the dim glow of that ever-present green dot. It pulsed like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I realized then that the house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like evidence. So I began writing this story in my head, every night, while the camera blinked. Not for them, for me. To remember the order of things. The moment care became custody. The minute love turned into management. The second I stopped being a mother and became a subject of observation. They think they're protecting me. But what they're really doing is teaching me how to disappear in plain sight. They think the camera gives them power. They don't know yet what it's like to be watched by someone who's finally paying attention. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable day that pretends it will leave no trace. The rain had stopped but left the windows freckled with dull silver, the sky still heavy and low. I was sitting in the armchair near the heater, knitting a scarf for no one in particular. The wool was soft, pale blue, a color I'd always liked because it reminded me of silence. Susan was on the phone in the kitchen, her voice sharp but careful, the way people sound when they know a door is half open. I wasn't eavesdropping, not at first. The walls in this house are thin, the kind that let every conversation seep through like water through paper. I heard her say my name in that clipped tone that always precedes an insult disguised as concern. "She's fine," she said. "But you know, the camera's picking up strange behavior. She talks to herself sometimes, wanders at night. The footage will help the lawyer." Then there was a pause, and her voice dropped lower, intimate, conspiratorial. "Once we have the guardianship in place, it'll be easier to transfer everything. The house, the account, yes, all of it. He said it's best to act while she's still lucid enough to sign. Otherwise, it gets messy." The words didn't hit me like a slap. They seeped in, slow and cold. My son walked in then, laughing about something unrelated, and she switched instantly to a chirping domestic tone. I sat there, needles in my hands, watching the yarn slip between my fingers like water, and I thought, so this is how betrayal sounds. Tidy, procedural, almost administrative. That evening, I tried to test the edges of what I had heard, to see if it could still be undone by reason. At dinner, I mentioned my will casually, said I might revisit it soon, maybe donate something to the library fund Walter and I used to support. My son's fork froze midair for just a second, a microsecond, but enough to tell me everything. "That's thoughtful, Mom," he said lightly, "but maybe let us help with that. Some of those charities can be scams, and you don't want to make mistakes." He smiled, reassuring, the smile of a man guiding an elderly relative through what he believes is inevitable decline. Susan poured me more water, not wine. She never pours me wine anymore. I could feel the camera on the shelf above the table catching it all. Their politeness, my stillness, the choreography of control. I realized then that nothing I did from that moment would be private. Every breath would be a record, every pause a potential diagnosis. They were collecting proof that I was slipping, and the beauty of it was that I didn't even need to be. Perception was enough. That night, I sat on my bed long after the lights were off, the faint hum of the camera like a mosquito in my skull. I replayed Susan's words again and again. Guardianship, transfer, lawyer. I imagined them sitting with that lawyer, perhaps the same one who helped us with Walter's estate years ago, smiling, explaining how concerned they were about my safety, how they'd noticed small lapses in memory, erratic behavior, all supported by footage. I imagined the lawyer nodding, taking notes, using phrases like preventative action and financial safeguarding. I could see the paperwork already forming, my signature already forged in their minds. That's when it dawned on me that this was not simply betrayal. It was strategy. And strategy can only be met with equal precision. I spent the next few days watching them watch me. The camera's reflection in the glass cabinet became a kind of clock, a reminder of who was in control. When Susan left the house, she always turned the system on manually, a small act of power disguised as care. I started to notice patterns. She'd check the footage in the mornings, after the children left for school, when the house was quiet. Sometimes she'd make small comments at breakfast. "You were up late last night," or "You seemed restless around 2." Always with that smile, gentle and poisonous. They were building a case, collecting moments of fatigue, hesitation, forgetfulness, and shaping them into incompetence. And yet, I said nothing. I responded as if I didn't see the trap tightening around me. The key to surviving control, I realized, is to let the controller believe they are winning. One afternoon, I asked to see the camera app, pretending curiosity. "How does it work?" I said, with the trembling fascination of the harmless. Susan beamed, eager to demonstrate. She opened the app on her phone, scrolling through short clips. Me adjusting the curtains, pouring tea, reading on the couch. "See?" she said. "It's just motion detection. It only records when you move. It's for your safety." I watched the thumbnails flicker past, my image duplicated and diminished, a ghost of myself. "You can even zoom," she added proudly, pinching the screen to magnify my face. My smile in the footage looked almost real. "That's remarkable," I said softly, and she mistook the awe in my voice for surrender. When she left, I sat at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee lingering, and wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper. "They are watching." Then, beneath it, in smaller letters, "So am I." The next morning, I went about my routine, but slower, deliberate, giving them what they wanted: confirmation. I let the camera see me misplace my keys, hesitate over the stove, stare into space a little too long. I was building a performance, the same way they were building a case. Only I knew what scene would come next. I started to recall details of Walter's old hobby. He had once set up bird-watching cameras in the backyard, connected to a small monitor in the garage. He used to say, "If you want to learn what people do when they think no one's looking, watch the birds. They're honest." After his death, I'd stored everything in a box in the attic, too heavy for nostalgia but too important to throw away. Now, it seemed, his honesty might save me. The real breaking point came 2 days later. I had gone into the kitchen for tea when I heard my name again, this time from my son. His voice was tight, hurried, the kind of tone that comes with guilt wrapped in justification. "Just make sure it looks natural," he said. "We can't have her thinking we're plotting anything. We'll say it's for the insurance evaluation, routine stuff. Susan, don't look at her that way in the videos. It'll look bad if anyone reviews the feed." My heart did not race, it settled. There was something almost comforting about hearing the lie confirmed. It meant I wasn't losing my mind, only my illusions. That night, as I brushed my hair in front of the mirror, I caught my reflection framed perfectly within the camera's gaze. I wondered if they could see the resolve forming in the corners of my eyes, the slow tightening of a plan that had begun the moment I overheard Susan's phone call. I whispered, almost playfully, "Good night, Susan. Good night, darling." Let them think I was slipping, talking to ghosts. Let them believe I was exactly what they wanted me to be. Docile, declining, done. They had no idea they'd just given me everything I needed. The catalyst wasn't rage. It was recognition. The moment you realize your enemy isn't a stranger, but a reflection of your own past generosity. I had built their safety, paid for their comfort, and now they were using it to erase me. But I wasn't done. I may have been old, but I was still a teacher, still precise, still capable of study. And what I had just learned, sitting quietly under that blinking green light, was this: surveillance is a two-way street. They thought they'd caged me inside their narrative, but the camera also gave me a stage. And on that stage, I could become anyone I needed to be. The performance had begun. They just didn't know they were already in it. From that day forward, the rhythm of the house changed, though outwardly everything remained polite and undisturbed, as though a play were continuing after the audience had gone home. I still woke early, the way older bodies do, not from rest, but from habit. I would sit in my chair with my tea, facing the window, and feel the weight of the camera's stare on the back of my neck. In that stillness, I began to sense the house itself adjusting to the quiet war being fought within its walls. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the creak of the floorboards sharper, the shadows stretched a little longer in the corners as if listening. It is strange how easily surveillance reshapes space. The rooms become diagrams of obedience. I learned to move more carefully, never quickly enough to trigger suspicion, never slowly enough to suggest frailty. I was crafting invisibility as deliberately as one might embroider a pattern, each gesture a stitch in my disguise. Susan continued her cheerful routines, arranging flowers that smelled faintly of disinfectant, wiping counters already clean, making sure the camera angles were never disturbed. Once she caught me dusting the small shelf where the lens was mounted and said with false brightness, "You don't have to worry about that, Mom. It's automatic." I smiled, nodded, and silently counted the seconds before she left the room. Then I adjusted the vase beside it half an inch, just enough to alter the reflection on the glass. That was the beginning of my small rebellions. During the days that followed, I observed the patterns of their watching. The app on Susan's phone made a soft chime whenever motion was detected. I could hear it sometimes from the hallway. I timed how long it took her to open the feed after the alert, how often she replayed the same moment. The first time I deliberately tested it, I dropped a spoon on the floor and waited. 34 seconds later, I heard the faint shuffle of her slippers approaching. "Everything all right?" she called out, voice too casual. "Just clumsy fingers," I said, and smiled into the invisible lens. That smile became my shield. Each day, I gave them fragments of performance. A pause too long at the window, a small sigh after a forgotten word, a tremor in my hand, exaggerated just enough. They wanted deterioration. I would feed it to them until they drowned in it. But beneath that surface, I was building something else entirely, a map of their routine, their dependence on the technology that watched me. My son, Michael, worked late most nights, his phone always buzzing with messages from his office. When he did come home, he avoided looking directly at me for too long, as if my presence were both necessary and unbearable. He spoke to me through the tone people reserve for children or pets. "You getting enough rest, Mom? Don't overexert yourself, okay?" I learned that the softer the voice of control, the sharper its teeth. Sometimes after he went to bed, I would stand in the hallway outside his office door and listen to the low murmur of his voice on calls. I never caught the full words, just the rhythm of justification. "She needs supervision. Doctor recommended. We're not doing anything wrong." It was the sound of someone convincing himself of his own virtue. The next morning, he'd greet me with coffee and the same careful affection, and I would thank him, always polite, always obedient. That was the game. We each pretended not to know what the other knew. The first real sign that they were escalating came in the form of medication. I noticed one morning that the pill organizer on my nightstand had been refilled with different capsules, same color, slightly altered shape. Susan explained it easily. "Your doctor switched brands, insurance reasons." She said it with such breezy confidence that I almost admired her. I nodded, pocketed one pill when she wasn't looking, and the next day took it to the pharmacy. The pharmacist looked puzzled. "This isn't your prescription," he said. "This one's much stronger. Causes drowsiness." I thanked him quietly and walked home under the pale winter light. the air crisp with the promise of frost. When I reached my room, I set the capsule on the desk and stared at it until the sun went down. It glowed faintly in the lamplight, a small, perfect weapon disguised as care. They wanted me slower, sleepier, less certain. A compliant patient is easier to declare incompetent. That evening, I made tea from chamomile instead and flushed the pill down the toilet, watching it swirl away like a tiny surrender I refused to give. Days blurred into each other, the monotony thickening around me like fog. I began to keep a journal in my head since paper could be found, read, photographed. Memory was safer than ink. I recorded details silently. How long Susan's car was gone when she ran errands, how often the Wi-Fi light blinked when the feed was active, the subtle way my son's voice dropped when he spoke to the lawyer on the phone. I became my own archivist, preserving evidence in thought rather than folders. But every evening, when the house settled into its digital hum, I felt the old loneliness creep in, that ancient hunger for touch, for the sound of someone speaking to me without purpose. Surveillance isolates you not just from privacy, but from intimacy. You start measuring love in the milliseconds between notifications. It was during one of those nights that I decided to test the system's limits. I waited until nearly 2 a.m, the hour when even machines seem tired. I stood up, walked slowly to the window, and pulled the curtain halfway. The green light blinked once, twice, then stayed steady. I stepped out of the frame, stood in the shadow by the dresser, and whispered, "Are you still watching?" No answer, of course, only the steady pulse of recording. But in that moment I felt something shift. Not defiance exactly, but a reclamation of self. They could see my body, not my intent. The camera could not read thoughts, at least not yet. I clung to that as to a thread of freedom. The next morning, Susan mentioned, as she buttered her toast, that the footage from last night was a bit odd. She laughed. "You just stood by the window for ages. I thought maybe you saw something outside." I shrugged. "Just thinking," I said. "The moon looked interesting." She smiled, satisfied with that simple answer, unaware that I'd just confirmed how obsessively she monitored every movement. I began to experiment more, standing motionless for random intervals, moving objects slightly, changing the order of items on the shelf. Each small act created discrepancies in the footage, anomalies that confused her sense of narrative. Control depends on predictability. I was eroding hers, one gesture at a time. Yet even as I maneuvered in secret, the weight of deception pressed on me. I would catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and hardly recognize the woman staring back. My spine was straighter now, my eyes sharper. But there was a hardness there that hadn't existed before. Resistance has a cost. It burns away softness. I wondered if Walter would have recognized this version of me, the quiet strategist. Perhaps he would have smiled. He always said I underestimated my own cunning. One afternoon, while Susan was out and Michael was at work, I ventured into the study. The door was usually closed, but that day it had been left ajar, as though inviting me. Inside, the air smelled of paper and faint cologne. On the desk sat a folder labeled with my name in neat, clinical letters. I hesitated only a moment before opening it. Inside were printed transcripts, timestamps, notes, and still images from the camera footage. Lines highlighted in yellow, seems confused, repeats stories, talks to herself. Under each note, Susan's initials. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something older, like recognition. They weren't just preparing to take my autonomy, they were documenting my extinction. I closed the folder carefully, exactly as I'd found it, and walked back to my room, every step deliberate. That night, as the house slept, I wrote my first real sentence in months, whispered into the dark. You cannot erase someone who is recording you too. After that, I moved with purpose. I cleaned my room meticulously, checked the angles of mirrors, learned the rhythm of the blinking light. The camera, once an oppressor, became a clock marking the hours of my endurance. I began to save bits of conversation on my phone under the guise of listening to music, a small library of evidence that grew quietly in my pocket. When Susan asked if I wanted to go to the doctor for memory tests, I smiled sweetly and said I'd love to, knowing that every lie she spoke in the waiting room would soon have company in my collection. I had stopped being their subject. I was becoming their observer. Still, there were moments of fatigue, flashes of doubt when the magnitude of the deception weighed heavy. I would lie in bed, feeling the familiar ache in my joints, and wonder if I was too late, if they had already set things in motion that could not be undone. But then I'd remember the sound of Susan's voice on that phone call, the precise cruelty of her tone, and strength would return. People like her believe that power flows only one way, downward, from youth to age, from confidence to frailty. They never imagine the current could reverse. I was learning to channel that current, to store it quietly until the right moment. The first escalation was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no raised voices, no slammed doors. It was the slow tightening of awareness, the quiet gathering of knowledge. They thought they were studying me, but I was already studying them, and that difference, small, invisible, unrecorded, was the beginning of their undoing. By the end of that week, I no longer felt afraid of the camera. I had learned its language, its rhythm, its limitations. And once you know how a machine breathes, you can decide when to hold your own breath and vanish from its gaze. It began with a simple discovery, so quiet and ordinary that at first, I didn't realize how much power it contained. One morning, while looking for an old family photo album in the attic, I found Walter's old laptop tucked inside a dusty box beside the bird-watching equipment he'd once used in the garden. The box smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, that peculiar scent of things too patient to die. The laptop was heavier than I remembered, covered in a thin film of neglect. I wiped it clean with the hem of my sleeve, carried it downstairs, and set it on my desk beneath the camera's indifferent gaze. I could almost hear Walter's voice, that calm, deliberate tone he used when explaining the simplest mechanisms of the world. It's never the machine that's clever, Ellie. It's the one who knows how to listen to it. The words felt like a quiet summons from the grave. When I pressed the power button, the screen blinked to life with a faint hum, the same sound that used to fill our evenings when he cataloged birds and storms and things I barely pretended to understand. I sat watching it boot, feeling the first spark of something I hadn't felt in years, curiosity unshackled by permission. It took me the better part of a day to remember his old passwords. They came slowly, like memories returning after a long illness. The name of our first cat, the year we married, the model number of the camera he'd bought for our anniversary. When the desktop finally opened, I found folders upon folders of footage. Tiny snippets of birds at the feeder, squirrels raiding the garden, even a few of me watering the roses. The timestamp read, 15 years ago. I scrolled through them, my younger self moving with brisk efficiency, unaware of being observed, hair still silver only at the temples. For a moment, I felt the ache of nostalgia so sharp it nearly broke my resolve. Then I noticed the software icon still installed on the taskbar. Home Vision Pro. Walter's old monitoring system. I clicked it open. The interface was archaic but functional, a relic from another time when technology still required respect. I realized that, with a few cables and the right cameras, I could connect this old skeleton of a machine to something newer. And then it came to me with startling clarity. If they could watch me, I could watch them. The symmetry of it almost made me laugh. The next day, when Susan drove to her yoga class and Michael left for the office, I ventured into the garage where all the unnecessary belongings had been exiled. There, under a tarp beside the mower, I found Walter's old camera mounts, small and sturdy, with rust beginning to bloom around the screws. I cleaned them quietly, the way one polishes an heirloom. I still had my own bank account, a small pension fund I never mentioned, tucked away like a secret breath. That afternoon, while Susan napped in the living room, I ordered 2 new micro cameras online using expedited delivery. They would arrive in 3 days. I deleted the purchase confirmation from my email and waited. Those 3 days were an eternity of composure. Every smile, every nod, every sip of tea had to look natural under the camera's constant gaze. But inside, my mind was alive again, quick and calculating, mapping where the new eyes would go. The bookshelf, the kitchen vent, the corner of the hallway where Susan often took her private calls. When the package finally arrived, small and unremarkable in its brown wrapping, I felt the strange pulse of adrenaline that only secrets can give. I installed the cameras in silence, steady hands guided by decades of careful domestic work. No one notices a woman who moves quietly through her own home. It's what they expect her to do. By evening, the network was live. Walter's laptop, slow but loyal, connected them all. I set the recordings to save automatically on an external drive and hid it inside an old tin of sewing supplies. That night, when the house went still, I opened the first feed. There was Susan in the kitchen, speaking on the phone. "She's fine," she said. "The doctor will back us up once he sees the footage. We just need her to agree to the evaluation. After that, it's a formality." She paused, listening, then laughed softly. "I know, it's awful, but she can't live alone. You should see her sometimes, just staring at the wall. I have the clips." I watched her face illuminated by the refrigerator light, her smile sharp and rehearsed. And I thought how peculiar it was that the woman accusing me of losing my mind could look so insane in her own reflection. From that moment, my fear began to drain away, replaced by something calmer, steadier, a kind of moral precision. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was documenting. Each evening, while they thought I slept, I reviewed the footage, labeling clips by date and content, the way Walter once labeled his birds. I cataloged their cruelty, their conspiracies disguised as family meetings, their careless remarks when they thought the old woman couldn't hear. I learned that Susan often adjusted my medication doses herself, sometimes doubling them, sometimes skipping days entirely. I watched Michael rehearse his concern in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing the tone of a son burdened by love. There were even rehearsed phrases. "She's declining fast. I wish she'd trust us. This is for her own good." I saved every word. My evidence was growing, my invisible wingspan expanding across their perfect little world. Yet there were moments when doubt returned, usually in the quiet hours just before dawn, when even resolve grows thin. I would lie awake, listening to the low hum of the machines, wondering if I had crossed into the same obsession that had consumed them. Surveillance, I learned, is contagious. Once you start watching, you can never unsee. One night, I caught Susan sitting in the dark kitchen, scrolling through her phone, her face lit ghostly blue. She wasn't reviewing footage that time. She was looking at photos of houses, real estate listings, vacation homes, places with descriptions like modern minimalist design, lakeview, turnkey ready. She wanted a life free of me, and in some grim way, I understood her. Freedom can make people cruel when they think someone else's life is the price of it. Then came the day of the assessment. They called it that, not realizing I already knew. A woman from a social services agency arrived, middle-aged, polite, dressed in a cardigan that screamed neutrality. She smiled warmly and asked if she could speak to me privately, though I noticed how Susan hovered just outside the doorway. The questions were simple at first. What day is it? Who is the president? Do you ever forget where you are? I answered slowly, carefully, letting a faint tremor into my voice but keeping my eyes sharp. When she asked if I felt safe, I hesitated, then said, I'm always being watched. Wouldn't you feel safe if everyone was? She gave me a look I couldn't read, then turned off her recorder. Later, I would find out from my own footage that as soon as I left the room, Susan cornered her in the hallway, whispering about my episodes. But the social worker hadn't expected my quiet confidence. It unsettled her. She's sharper than I was told, she said. Maybe she just feels a little isolated. Susan smiled, masking irritation. It's hard to tell sometimes. She hides it well. That night, I poured myself a glass of sherry and toasted the camera in the corner. To hiding it well, I said aloud. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was hiding everything, my evidence, my purpose, even my sanity. But unlike them, I wasn't erasing anyone. I was revealing what was already true. Over the next week, I compiled the footage into folders labeled Health, Finance, and Manipulation. It gave me a sense of order, a structure that turned chaos into clarity. In those quiet hours, hunched over the flickering glow of Walter's old screen, I no longer felt like a victim of their narrative. I was the archivist of their deceit, the historian of their hypocrisy. And with each file saved, each timestamp captured, I felt the old teacher in me reawaken. Knowledge is always the first rebellion. Still, I knew collecting evidence wasn't enough. The footage had to reach someone who could act on it. But timing is everything in both war and revelation. For now, I kept it close, nurturing the secret like a seed under frost. The shift had already begun. They still thought they were in control, but the balance had tilted almost imperceptibly toward me. Every smile I offered, every obedient nod, was now part of a larger design. The woman they believed too fragile to handle her own affairs was quietly dismantling their illusion of mastery, one recorded whisper at a time. For the first time in years, I felt alive in the purest sense. Not young, not free, but purposeful. Purpose, I've learned, is better than youth. It doesn't fade. It hardens into resolve. When I looked at the footage one evening, I caught a reflection of myself in the background, stooped, pale, but unmistakably composed. I realized then that I wasn't watching a victim anymore. I was watching a strategist at work. And as the camera's light blinked in acknowledgement, I thought how beautiful justice looks when it's patient. The shift from silence to confrontation did not happen with shouting or slammed doors. It began with an envelope. It was thin, official-looking, the kind of envelope that tries to look harmless through beige anonymity. I found it one morning beside my breakfast plate, the corner already slid open as if by accident. Inside was a letter from a law office I recognized from years before, the same firm that had handled Walter's estate. My son must have thought I wouldn't remember. The letter was written in polite, impersonal language that reeked of betrayal disguised as bureaucracy. It spoke of concern for my well-being, of necessary legal measures to ensure proper management of assets, and, most damningly, of an upcoming petition for partial guardianship. There was even a paragraph assuring me that this was not a reflection on my competence, merely a precautionary step. It takes a special kind of cruelty to use the word precaution when what they mean is confiscation. I sat at the table, the camera's lens blinking faintly above the mantel, recording the stillness of my face as I read the document twice. I made sure not to react. Anger is a luxury you cannot afford when you're being watched. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it under the teapot as though I had already forgotten it existed. That afternoon, when Susan came home from errands, she looked at the table and asked with feigned surprise if I had seen the mail. I told her I hadn't noticed anything important. She smiled too quickly and said, "It's probably just insurance paperwork." The kind of lie that only sounds true when it's meant for a camera. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by the faint blue glow of Walter's laptop and replayed the most recent recordings. There they were, my son and Susan, sitting on the couch after dinner, whispering as they sipped wine. "It's better this way," Susan said. "She won't have to worry about bills or decisions. We'll take care of everything." "And the lawyer?" Michael asked. "He said once we get the medical evaluation, it's straightforward. He even mentioned the footage. It's clear she's confused sometimes." Susan laughed softly, a laugh I had once mistaken for charm. "Then we're almost there." I listened to their voices, calm, practical, untroubled, as though they were discussing the disposal of an old piece of furniture. The camera captured everything, their faces, their tone, the gentle clink of glass. I knew then that I had reached the second escalation, the point of no return. What had begun as surveillance had become evidence. What had begun as compliance was now strategy. The next morning, Susan knocked on my door holding a stack of forms. She wore the expression of a nurse in a commercial, bright, false, determined to sell the illusion of care. "The doctor wants you to come in next week," she said. "Just routine memory testing, nothing serious." I looked up from my knitting and smiled. "Of course," I said, "but I'd like to bring a friend along." The sentence caught her off guard. She hesitated. "A friend?" "Yes," I said. "Just someone to help me understand the paperwork. I don't like feeling confused." She forced another smile, brittle this time. "That's fine," she said, but I could see her mind racing. After she left, I opened my old address book and found the number I had been saving for weeks. It belonged to Margaret Dyer, the woman who had once shared my desk in the school library 40 years ago, now a part-time assistant at a small legal office downtown. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly a decade, but when she answered and I said her name, her voice warmed instantly. "Eleanor! Good heavens, I thought you were long retired from the business of trouble." "Not quite," I said. "I think I'm just beginning." We met the next day in a cafe across from the courthouse. She was smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were still the same, sharp, unblinking, built for truth. I told her everything, the cameras, the pills, the letter, the performance. I even confessed about the secret recordings. She didn't interrupt, didn't blink, only nodded occasionally, as if marking each point in her mind. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "You have more leverage than you think. Send me copies of everything, and don't sign a thing until I tell you. They can't declare you incompetent if you can prove coercion." That night, I transferred all the video files to a flash drive. I labeled it quietly, Household Inventory 2025. The kind of name no one would ever question. I mailed a copy to Margaret the next morning and kept the original hidden in the lining of my old winter coat. From that moment, every day became a careful act of theater. I let Susan see me confused sometimes, asked her to repeat instructions, misplaced my reading glasses in plain sight. But behind that mask, I was gathering details, preparing for what Margaret called the confrontation phase. She said it would come soon, probably after the medical evaluation. "They'll need you to appear weak," she said. "So make sure you look invincible the moment they least expect it." The evaluation was scheduled for a Thursday. The doctor, a young man with hair too neat to be trustworthy, greeted me with excessive cheer. "We're just going to do a few simple tests, Mrs. Crane," he said. "Nothing to worry about." Susan sat in the corner pretending to read a magazine. I answered every question calmly, methodically, but added small hesitations at random intervals, enough to seem believable. When he asked me to draw a clock face, I drew it perfectly, except I placed the hands at 7:45 instead of 8 stav. He nodded sympathetically, making notes, probably thrilled to find his first case. By the end, he shook my hand with rehearsed compassion. "I'll be in touch," he said. As we drove home, Susan was quiet, unusually so. I could almost hear her heart pounding through the silence. She thought victory was near. That night, she poured herself extra wine. I watched her through my camera feed, smiling faintly as she called Michael. "It went well," she said. "He's on our side. The lawyer says we can proceed." The following morning, I invited her to go shopping with me. She looked startled, but agreed quickly. Guilt makes people eager to be agreeable. We went to a home goods store, the kind filled with gleaming appliances and artificial calm. I bought new curtains for my room, pale yellow with embroidered edges. She didn't realize that tucked between the folds of the fabric, I'd hidden a second flash drive, the backup copy. While she paid for her scented candles, I slipped it into my handbag and smiled. Back home, she asked me to rest while she made lunch. I sat quietly at the table, pretending to doze, and watched her through lowered eyelids as she stirred soup, her phone propped beside the cutting board, recording. Always recording. She thought I didn't notice the new angle of the camera she'd added in the kitchen, just above the fridge. I almost laughed. "Careful," I murmured to myself. "You're not the only one who knows how to install eyes." 2 days later, Margaret called. "I've reviewed everything," she said. "Your recordings are airtight. I've shown them to my boss. He's willing to represent you pro bono if this goes to court." Her voice softened. "Eleanor, do you realize what you've done? You've built a complete case of elder abuse without lifting a finger in violence." I felt an unexpected tear slip down my cheek, not from sorrow, but from something like vindication. "I just paid attention," I said. "That's all anyone ever needs to do." But peace was still a distant horizon. The confrontation came faster than I expected. One evening, as I was settling in with a book, Michael knocked on my door. His voice was gentle, almost tender. "Mom, can we talk?" He entered without waiting for an answer. Susan followed, clutching a folder. The air smelled of lavender and deceit. "We're worried about you," he began. "We think it's time to make some adjustments, just to help you manage day-to-day things." I looked up slowly, pretending confusion. "Adjustments?" "Financial oversight," Susan said quickly. "You'd still have access to your funds, but Michael would co-sign, just to make sure everything runs smoothly." "Like training wheels?" I asked, smiling faintly. Her face stiffened. "Exactly." Michael cleared his throat. "It's for your peace of mind, Mom. You've done so much for us. Let us do this for you." I nodded slowly, then said, "I appreciate that. I really do. But before we make anything official, I'd like you both to see something." I stood, went to the desk, and opened Walter's laptop. The screen lit the room with a cold blue glow. "You remember these cameras you installed for my safety?" I said. "Well, I installed a few of my own." I clicked play. The footage rolled. Susan tampering with my medication, Michael rehearsing concern, their whispered conversations about guardianship, their faces drained of color as their own words filled the room. "This," I said quietly, "is what you call care." Susan's hand flew to her mouth. Michael stood frozen, breathing shallowly. I closed the laptop. "I've already sent copies to my lawyer, Margaret Dyer. Do you remember her? She works with Harlan and Briggs now. They were very interested in this footage. Apparently, what you've done falls under the category of financial exploitation and coercive control. Serious offenses, I'm told." The silence that followed was almost holy. Then Michael whispered, "Mom, please, you don't understand." "No," I said. "I finally do." After that night, everything in the house changed. They stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. Susan no longer entered my room. The cameras remained, but I noticed the recording light was off more often now. Fear had shifted the balance. They didn't know whether to watch or hide. I kept my routine steady, tea at 7, reading at 9, but inside, I was preparing for the next step. Margaret advised patience. "Let them make the next move," she said. "The law will follow your calm." So I waited. I waited through their whispered arguments behind closed doors, through the sudden calls from numbers I didn't recognize, through the awkward silences at dinner. Waiting is not passive when you know the ending. It's rehearsal for justice. 2 weeks later, Margaret called again. "Eleanor, you might want to sit down," she said. "We've received word that your son tried to withdraw funds from your account using forged authorization. The bank flagged it." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "So it's begun," I said. "Yes," she replied. "And it ends when you're ready to make it end." The next morning, a man in a dark suit came to the door. He introduced himself as a representative from the same firm that had sent the guardianship letter. He wanted to clarify intentions. I invited him in, offered him tea, and handed him a neatly labeled envelope. "You'll find clarification inside," I said. He looked puzzled, but when he opened it and saw the transcript of their recorded conversation, along with a brief statement from Margaret's firm, his expression changed from polite to terrified. "You'll be hearing from us," he stammered. "I'm sure I will," I said, smiling. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the first snow fall across the yard. The camera's green light flickered once, then went dark for good. I felt neither triumph nor vengeance, only a profound stillness. I had not shouted, not threatened, not struck back with anything but the truth reflected in their own actions. The quietness of victory surprised me. It wasn't a storm. It was the end of one. They had set the trap, and I had simply stepped aside, letting them fall through their own performance. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just watches, patient and exacting, until the guilty look up and find themselves illuminated. The day of the reckoning came dressed as something ordinary, which is the only way truth ever walks into a house like mine. It was a Friday morning, mild and deceptively calm. Susan had gone to the grocery store. Michael was supposedly at work, and the house smelled faintly of coffee and the detergent she used on the curtains. The silence was soft, almost kind, but beneath it, I could feel the slow pulse of inevitability. Margaret had called the night before to tell me the petition for guardianship had officially been filed. "It's all proceeding now," she said. "The court will need to see your side of things. I've prepared the materials, but the judge must understand not just what they did, but who you are. Your voice matters, Eleanor." I thanked her and promised to be ready. I did not tell her that I had been ready for weeks. There is a moment in every quiet war when one realizes the battle has already been won. Only the paperwork remains. I had crossed that line the night I showed them the footage. Everything after was formality. That morning, the postman arrived later than usual. Among the usual bills and catalogs was another envelope, this one stamped "Notice of Hearing." The date was set for the following Tuesday. I held it for a long time, feeling its weight, as if paper could hold the sum of a family's corruption. I placed it neatly on the table, brewed tea, and sat before the camera that still loomed on the wall. Though I no longer believed it was even recording, I looked directly into its dead green eye and spoke anyway. "You will watch this one day," I said softly, "because people like you always need to review the evidence. So listen closely. You were right to think I was watching, but wrong to think I was powerless. You see, the thing about being underestimated is that it grants you perfect freedom. You never planned for the possibility that I could be clever quietly." Then I smiled. A small, unhurried smile meant not for the machine, but for the woman I had become through its surveillance. I felt lighter. I had rehearsed fear for so long that courage felt almost weightless by comparison. The weekend passed with the peculiar tension of waiting for a storm. Susan avoided me entirely. When we did cross paths, her face carried the brittle politeness of someone living in borrowed time. Michael stayed mostly in his office, his voice rising in agitation during phone calls I knew were with the lawyer. I didn't record those last conversations. I no longer needed to. The truth had already been captured, and they knew it. Sunday night brought a strange quiet to the house, the kind that sits not in the air but in the bones. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Even my own breath seemed amplified, like the room itself was holding its lungs full. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the reflection of the kitchen light on the surface. The tea rippled slightly with the motion of my hand, and I thought how that was all any of this had been, a disturbance across something calm, revealing the shape of what lay beneath. When Tuesday arrived, I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but precision. Presentation, Walter used to say, is the architecture of authority. I wore my navy suit, the one I had used for parent-teacher meetings in another life, and pinned his old silver brooch to my lapel. In the mirror, I looked like someone who had not merely survived, but endured. Margaret met me at the courthouse steps, brisk and unflappable. "They'll try to make you seem fragile," she whispered as we entered. "Let them. You only have to tell the truth once. The footage will speak for itself." Inside the courtroom, The air smelled faintly of paper and old wood. My son and Susan sat at the opposite table, whispering rapidly to their lawyer, who avoided meeting my eyes. I wondered if he knew, or if he was about to. When the judge entered, we all rose, and I felt an odd surge of calm, as though all the noise of the past months had condensed into this single point of stillness. The proceedings began predictably. Their lawyer spoke first, painting a portrait of an aging woman in decline, confused, forgetful, vulnerable. He spoke of safety, of love, of their selfless desire to protect me from myself. I listened without blinking. There was a strange beauty to his lies, the way they were constructed from fragments of truth, like a mosaic designed to obscure rather than reveal. When he finished, the judge nodded politely and turned to Margaret. She stood, composed, her hand resting lightly on the folder I had prepared. "Your Honor," she began, "what we have here is not protection. It is predation, and the evidence will demonstrate not only intent, but method." She opened the folder, inserted the flash drive into a small device, and the screen beside the bench flickered to life. The room dimmed. For the next 10 minutes, silence reigned as their own words filled the space. The whispers, the rehearsed conversations, the laughter over forged compassion. I watched the color drain from Susan's face, watched Michael's jaw tighten, his gaze fixed on the floor. When the footage ended, the judge looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "did you set up these recordings yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "After they installed cameras in my room without consent, I thought it only fair to return the favor. For balance." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "Balance," he repeated softly, as if savoring the word. "Indeed." The rest unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. The judge requested copies of the footage, instructed the bailiff to take a statement from me directly, and advised their counsel to consider the implications of coercion and elder exploitation. Margaret's voice was steady as she summarized the legal precedents, her precision cutting through their fabrications like glass through silk. By the time it ended, there was nothing left for them to stand on. The guardianship petition was not only denied, but flagged for investigation. The judge ordered a review of their financial activities concerning my accounts. As he delivered the ruling, I felt no surge of triumph, only the quiet settling of dust after demolition. There was, at last, space to breathe. Afterward, in the hallway, Michael approached me hesitantly. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. "Mom," he said, "I never meant to hurt you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, who once cried when his toy airplane broke. But the man before me had built his life on convenience, and convenience makes people crueler than necessity ever could. "You meant to help yourself," I said softly. "That's different." He tried to speak again, but no words came. Susan stood behind him, rigid, her eyes glassy with the cold disbelief of someone watching her own story dissolve. I didn't hate them. Hate requires energy, and I had spent enough already. I simply turned and walked away, my heels clicking steadily down the corridor, each sound an echo of finality. Outside, the air was crisp with early spring. The trees along the street were budding, the world going on as though justice were a seasonal occurrence, ordinary and expected. Margaret touched my arm gently. "You did beautifully," she said. "You didn't even have to raise your voice." I smiled. "I learned that from being a teacher," I said. "The quietest one in the room always holds the most power." We parted ways at the corner, and I walked home alone, each step lighter than the last. The house greeted me with silence, not the oppressive kind, but the restful one. I unplugged the remaining cameras, one by one, wrapping their cords neatly, setting them in a box by the door. When I reached the last one, the one in my bedroom, I hesitated. I looked at the lens, its surface reflecting my face back to me, and whispered, "We've seen enough of each other." Then I covered it with my hand, feeling its small, mechanical warmth fade beneath my skin. That night, for the first time in months, I slept with the lights off. No blinking green dots, no hum of artificial eyes, only the soft rhythm of my breath and the faint rustle of the curtains in the breeze. I dreamt of Walter, standing by the old bird feeder, sunlight in his hair. He turned, smiling, and said, "You listened, Ellie. You finally listened." When I woke, dawn was spilling across the room, quiet and golden. I made tea and carried it to the window, watching the light stretch across the yard where the camera cables once ran. The birds had returned. The world, I realized, always forgives itself faster than people do. But that morning, forgiveness didn't matter. What mattered was that I had been seen not through a lens, but by the truth itself. And the truth, when finally allowed to speak, needs no witness. Peace, when it finally came, did not arrive with celebration or music, or even the satisfaction I thought it might carry. It arrived as quiet, the kind that seeps in slowly until you realize it has replaced the pulse of fear that once lived beneath your ribs. The investigation into Michael and Susan stretched on for weeks, during which I heard nothing from them except through the letters their lawyers sent to Margaret. Each envelope was thinner than the last, their tone gradually changing from defensive to pleading. By the time the official notice came that the charges for attempted financial exploitation had been confirmed and the guardianship petition permanently dismissed, I felt nothing resembling victory. Only the strange, hollow clarity that comes after a long illness finally breaks. I moved out of their house a few days later. It was Margaret who found me a small apartment across town, a quiet building with balconies that looked out over the park. The rent was modest, the walls clean and pale, and there was no camera waiting in any corner. When I unlocked the door for the first time, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. I stood there for a long moment before stepping inside, half afraid that the silence would feel like loneliness. But it didn't. It felt like ownership. The first few days, I moved through the space like someone relearning gravity. I arranged my few belongings carefully, keeping only what was necessary. Walter's books went on one shelf, the old laptop on another. I set up a small table by the window where the morning light fell gently, a perfect place for tea and observation. The habit of being watched takes time to fade. For weeks, I still caught myself glancing toward corners, expecting the faint blink of a lens. But gradually, the reflex lost its power. I began to fill the apartment with small, deliberate sounds, classical music at low volume, the scratch of my pen across paper, the kettle's whistle at precisely 7 each morning. It was not joy, not yet, but something quieter and sturdier. Presence. The kind that doesn't demand permission. I went back to the library one afternoon, just to see if I still belonged somewhere public. The same building where I had worked decades ago still smelled of paper and dust, though the computer terminals were newer and the chairs more colorful. The young librarian at the desk asked if I needed help logging into the catalog. I smiled and told her I remembered how to find what I wanted. She didn't know that the act of saying that, remembering, choosing, was a declaration of sovereignty. I spent hours there, reading case studies on privacy, ethics, and the philosophy of observation. It amused me that after a lifetime of teaching literature, I was now drawn to the anatomy of watching itself. I even wrote small notes for Margaret about elder privacy laws, though I never sent them. It felt good just to think in sentences that belonged to me. One evening, I received a letter from Michael. It was brief, written in a trembling hand I barely recognized. He apologized, not eloquently, but plainly. He said that fear had driven him, fear of loss, fear of time, fear of watching his mother fade as his father once did. He wrote that Susan had left him and that he was trying to understand what went wrong. I read it twice and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I did not answer. Forgiveness is not refusal, but timing, and mine wasn't ready yet. Still, I wished him well in silence, the way one might wish calm weather for a distant city. The heart, after all, can only hold so much bitterness before it begins to mirror what it resents. As spring ripened, I began to find small rituals that made the days full again. I bought a small bird feeder for the balcony, a simple one, not digital, just a wooden tray with seed. The first time a finch landed there, I laughed aloud. Its movements were quick, unobserved, and utterly free. Sometimes, I leave the balcony door open just to hear their wings. I still have one camera, the last one I installed, but it's turned outward now. It watches the trees, the street, the rhythm of life beyond my window. The footage is mostly sky and weather, but sometimes children run past, or neighbors water their plants, or a dog pauses to stare upward as if acknowledging me. I keep the recordings, not as evidence but as memory. It feels right that after all this time, I am the one who decides what deserves to be remembered. Margaret visits occasionally, bringing pastries and gossip about the courthouse. Once, she said, "You know, Eleanor, they're teaching your case now in a seminar about elder rights. You might have changed something bigger than you realize." I laughed. All I did was refuse to disappear. She smiled back. That's how most revolutions start. After she leaves, I often sit by the window with my tea and think about how thin the line is between observation and erasure. They thought they were documenting my decline, but what they captured instead was my awakening. There's a strange beauty in that symmetry. Their footage built the cage. Mine built the key. The last night of the story, the one I now live in, I dreamt I was back in my old house. The rooms were empty, stripped bare of furniture, the air filled with dust motes and faint light. The cameras were gone, every wall clean, but I could still hear faint echoes of the lives that had played out there. In the dream, I opened the windows one by one, letting air flood in until the house itself seemed to breathe. When I woke, dawn was just beginning to color the sky, a soft pink spreading across the horizon like a quiet promise. I made tea and carried it to the balcony. The birds were already awake, the city below murmuring into its routines. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to narrate my actions or justify my existence. There was no audience left but the morning itself. So now I live simply, without witnesses, and that simplicity feels like the most profound form of wealth. Sometimes, young women in the building stop to talk to me, asking about recipes or advice or how I keep my plants alive. I tell them stories, but never the whole story. It's enough that they see an old woman who survived something invisible and came out clear-eyed. Once a girl said, "You seem fearless." I smiled and said, "No one is fearless. Some of us just learned that fear can be recorded, and that's enough to keep it honest." She laughed, not understanding, but that's fine. Understanding is a slow inheritance. If anyone ever asks me now what justice felt like, I will say it didn't feel like triumph or punishment. It felt like breath returning to a body that had forgotten how to inhale. It felt like walking through a room that no longer watched back. And if some woman older than me ever hears this story and feels the cold hand of suspicion tightening around her, I hope she remembers this. Safety is not something they can install for you. It's something you reclaim quietly, one deliberate act at a time. Let them watch. Let them think you're fading. Just keep the record straight in your own way. One day, when the light changes, they'll see what you've seen all along.